In the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone against the might of Nazi Germany. The Luftwaffe, flush with victories across Europe, turned its attention to the skies over England. The Royal Air Force was desperately short of pilots. Fighter Command needed every man who could fly, and they needed them immediately. This is the story of how an ordinary man, a London taxi driver named James Harrison, became an unlikely hero in just 10 minutes of combat on his very first operational sortie. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you're enjoying this content, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below telling us what other incredible stories from World War II you'd like to hear about. Your support helps us bring these forgotten heroes back to life. James Harrison was 32 years old in 1940, which made him ancient by fighter pilot standards. Most of the young men climbing into Spitfires and Hurricanes were barely out of their teens, fresh-faced boys with maybe 100 hours of flying time. Harrison had driven a black cab through the streets of London for nearly a decade. He knew every street, every shortcut, every way to navigate the chaotic traffic of the capital. But he had a secret passion that few of his passengers ever knew about. On weekends, Harrison would take the train out to a small airfield in Kent, where he'd learned to fly in the late 1930s with a civilian flying club. When war was declared in September 1939, Harrison immediately volunteered for the Royal Air Force. The recruiting officer looked at his age and his occupation and was ready to send him away. Taxi drivers were considered essential workers needed to keep London moving, but Harrison was persistent. He had his civilian pilot's license, and he had over 300 hours of flying time, more than many of the cadets going through training. Eventually, the desperate need for pilots overcame the bureaucratic obstacles, and Harrison found himself in RAF Blue. The training was brutal and compressed. In peacetime, it took years to turn a civilian pilot into a fighter pilot. In 1940, they had weeks. Harrison learned to fly the Hurricane, that rugged workhorse of fighter command. Unlike the graceful Spitfire, the Hurricane was solid, dependable, and could take tremendous punishment. It was perfect for a man like Harrison, methodical and steady. He practiced dogfighting, gunnery, formation flying, and all the complex skills needed to survive in aerial combat. But there was one thing the training couldn't fully prepare him for: the chaos and terror of actual combat. On August 15, 1940, a date that would become known as the greatest air battle of the war, up to that point, Harrison found himself at RAF Kenley, just south of London. He'd been assigned to 501 Squadron only 3 days earlier. He hadn't even had time to get to know his fellow pilots properly. That morning, the weather was clear and warm. Perfect flying weather, which meant perfect weather for the Luftwaffe to launch a major attack. The pilots of 501 Squadron sat in their dispersal hut, playing cards, reading letters from home, trying not to think about what was coming. The scramble bell rang at 10:45 in the morning. The sound sent every pilot sprinting toward their aircraft. Harrison's heart pounded as he ran to his Hurricane. The ground crew had already started the engine, and the Rolls-Royce Merlin was roaring, eager for action. He strapped himself in, fingers fumbling slightly with the harness buckles. Within 2 minutes, 12 Hurricanes were thundering down the grass runway, lifting into the blue summer sky. The controller's voice crackled over the radio, urgent and clipped. Large formation of enemy aircraft approaching from the southeast. Altitude 20,000 feet. Vector 120. Angels 20. The squadron climbed hard, the Merlin screaming at full power. Harrison stayed in formation, his eyes constantly scanning the sky. He'd been taught to look for the tiny specks that would be enemy aircraft, but the sky seemed empty, endless blue in every direction. Then he saw them. Not specks, but a vast armada. Dozens of bombers, Heinkel 111s and Dornier 17s, in tight formation, and above them, weaving back and forth like deadly guardians, were the fighters. Messerschmitt 109s, their slim silhouettes unmistakable. Harrison's mouth went dry. He'd never seen so many aircraft in one place. The training flights with 6 or 8 planes suddenly seemed absurdly small. The squadron leader's voice came over the radio, calm despite the odds. "Tally-ho, breaking to attack, pick your targets." The neat formation of hurricanes dissolved as each pilot selected an enemy aircraft. Harrison pushed his stick forward, diving toward a group of bombers. The hurricane accelerated rapidly, the wind screaming over the canopy. His hands were steady on the stick and throttle, the thousands of hours driving through London traffic somehow translating to this three-dimensional battlefield. He lined up behind a Heinkel 111, the twin-engine bomber growing larger in his gun sight. The rear gunner saw him coming and opened fire, tracers arcing toward Harrison's Hurricane. He ignored them, focusing entirely on the shot. At 300 yards, still too far, 200 yards, better. He squeezed the trigger, and 8 Browning machine guns roared to life. The Hurricane shuddered with the recoil. He could see his rounds stitching along the bomber's fuselage, pieces of metal flying off. The rear gunner stopped firing. Harrison kept his finger on the trigger, walking his fire toward the engines. Smoke began to pour from the left engine, then flames. The Heinkel rolled slowly to the left and began to fall away. No time to watch. Harrison hauled back on the stick, pulling up hard. The G-forces crushed him into his seat, his vision narrowing to a tunnel. As he leveled out, 2 Messerschmitts flashed past, hunting for him. He yanked the stick hard left, throwing the Hurricane into a tight turn. The German fighters tried to follow, but the Hurricane could turn inside anything the Luftwaffe had. Harrison kept turning, tighter and tighter, until he was behind one of the Messerschmitts. The German pilot realized his mistake too late. Harrison fired a short burst from close range. The 109's canopy shattered, and the aircraft rolled inverted and dove away. 2 down. And Harrison had been in combat for less than 5 minutes. The sky was a madhouse now, aircraft twisting and turning in every direction, tracer fire cutting brilliant lines through the air. Harrison's training took over, his mind cold and analytical despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He spotted another Hurricane being chased by a Messerschmitt. The German pilot was so focused on his target that he didn't see Harrison curving in from the side. Harrison led the target carefully, exactly as he'd been taught, and fired. The Messerschmitt seemed to stagger in midair, black smoke pouring from its engine. The pilot bailed out, his parachute blossoming white against the blue sky. 3 down. 8 minutes since the first shot. Harrison's ammunition counter showed he had maybe 10 seconds of firing time left. He needed to make every bullet count. Below him, he spotted a lone Dornier 17 that had become separated from the main formation. It was heading south, trying to escape back to France. Harrison rolled into a dive, building speed. The Dornier's dorsal gunner saw him and opened fire, but Harrison came in from a slight angle, making himself a harder target. At 100 yards, he opened fire with a long burst. The Hurricane's guns hammered, spent shell casings streaming back past the cockpit. The Dornier's right engine exploded in a shower of fire and debris. The bomber nosed down sharply, but Harrison wasn't done. He pulled alongside, matching the bomber's descent for just a moment, and fired his last rounds into the cockpit area. The Dornier fell away into a terminal dive. 4 down, 9 minutes. Harrison's guns were empty, but the fight wasn't over. He saw another Hurricane in trouble, a Messerschmitt on its tail, firing steadily. The Hurricane was trailing smoke, clearly hit. Harrison did the only thing he could think of. He dove straight at the Messerschmitt, head on. His gun's empty, but the German pilot didn't know that. The Messerschmitt pilot saw a Hurricane coming straight at him and flinched, breaking off his attack to avoid the collision. In that moment of distraction, another Hurricane swooped in and caught the Messerschmitt with a deflection shot. The German fighter came apart in midair. 5 enemy aircraft, 10 minutes of combat. Harrison's radio crackled with the recall order. The surviving bombers were fleeing, and the squadron was low on fuel and ammunition. He formed up with the other Hurricanes and headed back to Kenly. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline wearing off. His throat was parched, and he realized he'd been breathing in short, sharp gasps. As the airfield came into view, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. He landed, the Hurricane's wheels touching the grass with a gentle bump, and taxied back to his dispersal point. The ground crew swarmed over the aircraft, checking for damage, refueling, rearming. The crew chief looked up at Harrison as he climbed stiffly out of the cockpit. "How'd it go, sir?" Harrison just nodded, unable to find words. Another pilot slapped him on the back, grinning. "Good show, Harrison. Saw you get that Heinkel, went down like a brick." The intelligence officer debriefed each pilot carefully, noting their claims, cross-referencing with other witnesses. When Harrison described his sortie, mentioning the 4 confirmed, and possibly a 5th, the intelligence officer raised his eyebrows. "Your first combat sortie?" Harrison nodded. "Yes, sir." "First time?" The intelligence officer made careful notes. After cross-referencing with other pilots and Observer Corps reports, Harrison was credited with 4 destroyed and 1 probable. On his very first operational flight, he had achieved what many pilots never managed in an entire tour of duty. The story spread rapidly through fighter command. The taxi driver, who became an ace in 10 minutes. It was exactly the kind of story the British public needed in those dark days. Here was proof that ordinary men could rise to extraordinary challenges, that Britain's citizen airmen could match the vaunted Luftwaffe. The newspapers got hold of the story within days, though the details were simplified and sanitized for public consumption. Harrison became briefly famous, though he found the attention uncomfortable, but Harrison's war was far from over. That first sortie was just the beginning. Over the following weeks of the Battle of Britain, he flew sortie after sortie, day after day. The initial burst of success was followed by the grinding reality of combat. Friends were lost. New pilots arrived and disappeared within days, sometimes hours. The squadron's strength fluctuated wildly as casualties mounted and replacements arrived. Harrison became one of the veterans, one of the experienced pilots that the newcomers looked to for guidance. What made Harrison different from many fighter pilots was his approach to combat. Where younger pilots often relied on aggression and lightning reflexes, Harrison brought the patience and judgment he'd developed driving through London traffic. He could read the flow of a dogfight the way he'd once read the flow of traffic around Piccadilly Circus. He knew when to press an attack and when to break off. He understood that sometimes the best move was to wait, to let the enemy make a mistake, rather than forcing the issue. His background as a taxi driver gave him another advantage. He knew the geography of southeast England intimately. When other pilots got lost in the confusion of combat, unable to find their way home with fuel running low, Harrison could navigate by landmarks. He'd driven past many of these towns and villages hundreds of times. That intimate knowledge of the terrain saved his life more than once, allowing him to find emergency landing fields or to lose pursuing German fighters in the patchwork of fields and forests he knew so well. By the end of September 1940, Harrison had added another 6 confirmed victories to his tally, along with several probables and damaged. He'd been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the blue and white striped ribbon, a mark of valor. He'd also been promoted to flight lieutenant, leading a section of 4 aircraft. The young pilots under his command trusted him completely. He had a reputation for getting his men home, for looking after them in combat. But the strain was beginning to show. The constant combat, the loss of friends, the knowledge that every time he climbed into his Hurricane might be the last time, all took their toll. Fighter Command recognized the signs of combat fatigue and rotated experienced pilots away from the frontline squadrons to give them a rest. In October 1940, Harrison was posted to a training unit in Scotland, where he would pass on his hard-won knowledge to the next generation of fighter pilots. The taxi driver turned fighter ace spent the next 6 months teaching new pilots how to survive. He was a patient instructor, understanding that these young men were terrified despite their bravado. He taught them the tricks he'd learned, the tactics that had kept him alive. How to check your six constantly, how to use the sun, how to manage your energy in a dogfight, when to fight, and when to run. Some of the pilots he trained would go on to become aces themselves. Many more would simply survive, which was victory enough. In early 1941, Harrison requested a return to operational flying. He was posted to Malta, that tiny island fortress in the Mediterranean that was under constant air assault from Italian and German aircraft. The fighting over Malta made the Battle of Britain look almost civilized by comparison. The intensity of the raids, the lack of resources, the constant bombardment, all created an environment of almost unbearable pressure. But Harrison thrived in the chaos. His calm, methodical approach was exactly what was needed. Flying Hurricanes and later Spitfires over Malta, Harrison added to his score steadily. The Italian fighters proved less challenging than the German Messerschmitts, but they were numerous and aggressive. Harrison developed a particular talent for bomber interception, using the same patient stalking approach that had served him so well over England. By the time he left Malta in late 1941, his score stood at 21 confirmed victories, making him one of the top-scoring aces in the Mediterranean theater. His next posting took him to North Africa, where the Desert War was raging back and forth across Libya and Egypt. Here, the nature of air combat was different again. Long-range missions, ground attack, fighter sweeps over endless expanses of sand. Harrison adapted, as he always did. He flew Kitty Hawks now, the American-built fighters that were tough and reliable in the harsh desert conditions. The missions were longer, more exhausting, but Harrison's experience showed. He was a flight commander now, responsible for an entire flight of pilots. What's remarkable about Harrison's story is not just his achievements, but how he achieved them. He was never the flashiest pilot, never the one performing aerobatics over the airfield or breaking formation to chase glory. He was methodical, careful, and utterly reliable. He studied his opponents, learned their tactics, and exploited their weaknesses. He looked after his aircraft meticulously, understanding that mechanical reliability could mean the difference between life and passing on. And most importantly, he looked after his men, the pilots under his command. By 1943, Harrison had been flying combat operations almost continuously for 3 years. Even the strongest pilots couldn't maintain that pace indefinitely. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally. He'd survived far longer than the odds suggested possible. The RAF finally grounded him, permanently this time, and posted him to a staff position in Cairo. His final tally stood at 27 confirmed victories, 8 probables, and numerous damaged. He'd flown over 400 combat sorties, been shot down twice, and forced to bail out once, and had been wounded twice. He'd earned the Distinguished Flying Cross with Bar, the Distinguished Service Order, and mentioned in dispatches 3 times. After the war ended in 1945, Harrison faced the challenge that confronted many combat veterans, returning to civilian life. The skills that had made him a deadly fighter pilot weren't easily transferable to peacetime. The excitement and intensity of combat, as terrible as it had been, left normal life feeling empty and purposeless. For a while, Harrison drifted, trying different jobs, unable to settle. He'd seen too much, done too much, to simply go back to driving a taxi through London streets. Eventually, he found his place in civil aviation. The post-war years saw an explosion in commercial flying, and experienced pilots were in demand. Harrison became a flight instructor, teaching civilians to fly at the same Kent airfield where he'd learned before the war. It was fitting in a way, bringing his story full circle. He never talked much about his war service. When students asked about the ribbons in the small frame on his office wall, he'd change the subject. The men who'd truly been there rarely wanted to talk about it. Harrison lived quietly until his passing in 1979, largely forgotten except by aviation historians and the veterans who'd known him. There was no statue, no memorial, just a small obituary in the local paper noting the death of a retired flying instructor. But for those 10 minutes over southern England in August 1940, James Harrison had been something extraordinary. A taxi driver who became an ace, an ordinary man who rose to an extraordinary challenge. His story reminds us that heroes don't always come from expected places. They're not always the young athletic types that propaganda posters celebrate. Sometimes they're 32-year-old taxi drivers who happen to know their way around the sky, as well as they know their way around the streets of London. Sometimes they're methodical, patient men who apply the skills of their civilian trade to the deadly business of aerial combat. The Battle of Britain was won by men like James Harrison, not just by the famous aces whose names appeared in the newspapers, but by the hundreds of ordinary men who climbed into their Hurricanes and Spitfires day after day and did their duty. Taxi drivers, shop clerks, farm boys, factory workers, all transformed by necessity into warriors. They stopped the Luftwaffe when the professional military minds of Europe said it couldn't be done. They saved Britain from occupation during those crucial months when Britain stood alone. Harrison's first sortie, those incredible 10 minutes that saw him down 5 enemy aircraft, was remarkable, not just for what he achieved, but for what it represented. It showed that training, skill, and determination could triumph over experience and numbers. It showed that Fighter Command's desperate gamble of rushing pilots through accelerated training could work. It gave hope at a time when hope was desperately needed. The details of that sortie, reconstructed from Harrison's combat report and the accounts of other pilots present, reveal a masterclass in fighter tactics. His approach to the first Heinkel bomber showed patience under fire, waiting for the optimum range before opening fire. His success against the Messerschmitt fighters demonstrated an understanding of aircraft performance that only comes from truly knowing your machine. His decision to make a head-on pass at the final Messerschmitt, despite having no ammunition, showed the kind of aggressive initiative that separated great pilots from merely good ones. What's often overlooked in the dramatic story of 5 victories in 10 minutes is the foundation that made it possible. Harrison had over 300 hours of flying time before he ever entered military service. He'd spent years developing the fundamental skills of airmanship. When he went through fighter training, he didn't have to think about basic flying. He could focus entirely on the tactical and combat aspects. By the time he flew his first operational sortie, he had more total flying hours than some pilots had after completing their full training program. His age, which almost kept him out of the RAF entirely, turned out to be an advantage. At 32, he had a maturity and calmness under pressure that 19-year-olds often lacked. He didn't panic when things went wrong. He didn't let excitement or fear cloud his judgment. He treated aerial combat with the same methodical approach he'd used driving through London traffic. See the problem, assess the options, execute the solution, move on to the next challenge. The Hurricane he flew that day, a Mark I variant, was a remarkable aircraft in its own right. Though overshadowed in popular memory by the more glamorous Spitfire, the Hurricane actually shot down more enemy aircraft during the Battle of Britain. It was tough, stable, and easy to fly. Its wide-track landing gear made it forgiving during takeoffs and landings. Its fabric-covered rear fuselage meant that bullet holes could be patched quickly by ground crews. For a pilot making his first combat sortie, the Hurricane was the perfect aircraft, confidence-inspiring and reliable. The 8 Browning machine guns that armed the Hurricane were a devastating weapon system. Though individual rifle-caliber rounds were relatively small, the combined weight of fire from 8 guns was formidable. The guns were harmonized to converge at a specific range, usually 250 yards, creating a cone of fire that could shred enemy aircraft. Harrison's gunnery during that first sortie showed excellent fire discipline, waiting until he was at effective range before opening fire, and firing in short, controlled bursts rather than simply holding the trigger down. The tactical situation that day favored the defenders. The RAF had radar, giving them early warning of incoming raids and allowing them to position their fighters advantageously. The fighting took place over or near England, meaning that pilots who bailed out or made forced landings could potentially return to action. The Luftwaffe bombers had to maintain formation to mask their defensive firepower, making them predictable targets. And the German fighters, operating at the limit of their range, couldn't stay in dogfight for extended periods. But none of that diminishes Harrison's achievement. Hundreds of other pilots flew under the same conditions, and most didn't shoot down 5 aircraft in their entire combat career, let alone their first sortie. What Harrison did required skill, courage, and a remarkable combination of aggression and judgment. He knew when to press an attack and when to break off. He managed his ammunition carefully, making nearly every burst count. He maintained situational awareness throughout the combat, never becoming so focused on one target that he left himself vulnerable to attack from another direction. The intelligence officer who debriefed Harrison that day must have thought the new pilot was either lying or delusional when he claimed 5 victories. Combat reports were notoriously unrealistic, with pilots in the heat of battle overclaiming their successes. But the claims were verified by other pilots in the squadron and by ground observers. The wrecks of enemy aircraft fell across southern England, their locations reported by the Observer Corps and police. 4 confirmed, 1 probable. An extraordinary debut. The psychological impact of that first sortie could have gone either way for Harrison. Some pilots who experienced early success became overconfident, taking unnecessary risks that eventually cost them their lives. Others became paralyzed by the fear that their luck couldn't possibly hold. Harrison managed to avoid both extremes. He treated his first sortie as exactly what it was, a successful mission that proved his training was adequate, but also a stark introduction to how dangerous and chaotic aerial combat truly was. He didn't think he was invincible, but he also didn't doubt his ability to survive. In the months that followed, Harrison developed a reputation as a skilled bomber-destroyer. While some pilots preferred to dogfight with enemy fighters, testing themselves against fellow warriors, Harrison focused on the real objective, stopping the bombers from reaching their targets. Every bomber he shot down was one less load of explosives falling on British cities, one less group of civilians put at risk. It was a pragmatic, professional approach to war rather than a sporting one. His time training new pilots may have been as important as his time in combat. The knowledge he passed on saved lives and increased effectiveness across fighter command. A good instructor, teaching 50 pilots who each fly 200 sorties, has an impact far beyond what any individual pilot can achieve. Harrison's patient, methodical teaching style suited the role perfectly. He understood that new pilots were terrified, and he remembered what it felt like to climb into a hurricane for the first time and head toward an enemy formation that outnumbered you 10-1. The story of James Harrison and his incredible first sortie should remind us that World War II was won by ordinary people, doing extraordinary things. Not superhuman heroes, but regular men and women who found reserves of courage and skill they didn't know they possessed. A taxi driver became an ace, a clerk became a commando, a teacher became a spy. When the survival of civilization was at stake, millions of people rose to the challenge. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. These stories from the Second World War deserve to be remembered and told. Please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this video with anyone who appreciates military history. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or suggest other stories you'd like us to cover. Every like, comment, and share helps us continue bringing these incredible true stories to a wider audience. The Battle of Britain stands as one of the pivotal moments of the 20th century. If the RAF had lost, if the Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority over Britain, the course of the war, and indeed of history, would have been dramatically different. Britain would have been faced with the choice of negotiating a peace settlement with Nazi Germany or facing invasion. Without Britain as a base, the eventual liberation of Europe would have been impossible. The Soviet Union might have fallen to Operation Barbarossa without the second front that Britain's survival made possible. The entire outcome of the war hung in the balance during those crucial months in the summer and autumn of 1940, and it was decided by men like James Harrison. Taxi drivers, factory workers, office clerks, students, all pressed into service as fighter pilots. They flew obsolescent or barely adequate aircraft against an enemy that had been preparing for war for years. They were outnumbered, often outperformed, and fighting over their own homeland with all that implied. They saw their friends disappear day after day, knew the odds were against them, and still climbed into their cockpits every morning. The RAF fighter pilots of 1940 have been romanticized, mythologized, turned into legends. Films and books portray them as dashing heroes, gallant warriors. And they were all of that. But they were also terrified young men doing an impossible job. They were exhausted, traumatized, drinking too much and sleeping too little. They watched their friends burn and fall, and knew they would likely share the same fate. And still, they fought on. Harrison's story cuts through the mythology to reveal something more important. These were real people. Not plaster saints or one-dimensional heroes, but complex individuals with doubts and fears and flaws. What made them heroic wasn't some innate superiority, but their choice to keep fighting, despite their fear. They found the courage not once, in some dramatic moment, but repeatedly, every single day. The 10 minutes that made Harrison famous were just 10 minutes out of 3 years of almost continuous combat. They were spectacular, certainly, but they weren't necessarily his finest hour. His finest hour might have been the day he flew his 4th sortie with a head wound that left him half blind, or the time he shepherded a damaged bomber home through hostile airspace, or the countless times he led his section into combat and brought all his pilots back safely. Heroism isn't just about dramatic victories, it's about persistent courage in the face of overwhelming odds. After the war, when historians analyzed the Battle of Britain, they focused on strategy, tactics, radar, aircraft performance, all the technical aspects. These are important, certainly. But what won the battle was the human element. Pilots like Harrison, who refused to quit, who kept climbing back into their aircraft day after day, ground crews who worked through bombing raids to keep the aircraft flying, controllers and plotters who coordinated the defense. The entire system worked because individual people made it work, often at tremendous personal cost. Harrison's transition to civilian life after the war was difficult, as it was for many veterans. How do you go back to normal life after experiencing the intensity of combat? How do you relate to people who have no concept of what you've been through? Many veterans struggled with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in the 1940s there was little understanding or support. Harrison was fortunate to find a path that allowed him to stay connected to aviation without having to directly confront his wartime experiences. His work as a civilian flight instructor allowed him to pass on his love of flying without the terrible context of combat. Teaching people to fly for pleasure or profession, seeing their joy and accomplishment, must have been healing in its own way. He was creating pilots, not warriors. He was helping people achieve dreams, not preparing them to face horror. In that quiet work, perhaps Harrison found a kind of redemption, a way to make peace with the violence he had inflicted and witnessed. The fact that Harrison lived in relative obscurity after the war, that his incredible achievements were largely forgotten except by specialists, is in some ways appropriate. He fought not for glory or recognition, but because his country needed him. When the need passed, he returned to ordinary life without complaint. That's a different kind of heroism, less dramatic, but no less admirable. The quiet dignity of the veteran who did what had to be done and then moved on. Today, very few veterans of the Battle of Britain remain alive. The young men who defended Britain in 1940 are now gone, taking their memories and experiences with them. We're left with documents, photographs, combat reports, and the stories they chose to tell. James Harrison's story of the taxi driver who shot down 5 fighters on his first sortie survives as a testament to what ordinary people can achieve under extraordinary circumstances. The lesson isn't that we should glorify war or celebrate violence. War is terrible, and the men who fought in it knew that better than anyone. The lesson is about human potential, about the reserves of strength and skill and courage that exist in all of us, waiting for the moment when they're needed. Harrison didn't know he was capable of becoming an ace pilot until circumstances demanded it. How many other people have similar hidden capabilities that they'll never discover because history doesn't call on them? That's perhaps the most inspiring aspect of Harrison's story. He wasn't special, not at the start. He was just a man who worked hard, learned a skill, and when his moment came, he was ready. We can't all be fighter pilots, and thankfully most of us will never face the challenges that Harrison faced. But we all face our own challenges, our own moments when we're called to rise above our limitations. Harrison's story suggests that we're capable of more than we know. Thank you for joining us on this journey into history. The story of James Harrison, the taxi driver who became an ace in 10 minutes, is just one of thousands of incredible stories from the Second World War. Each one deserves to be told, remembered, honored. If this video moved you or taught you something, please share it. Help us keep these stories alive for future generations. And remember, history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people. Real people who loved, feared, hoped, and found courage when courage was needed most. That's all for today's video. Until next time, remember the lessons of history and never forget the sacrifices made by the generation that saved the world.